Hello everyone, and welcome to my time-lapse video for this month's Patreon rewards. The first one, actually, and I have to be honest with you, recording my voice is not something I'm very comfortable with yet, but I guess that's something I'm going to get used to. As you can see, I started this art piece close that we're going to see the process of in this video by creating a pencil and ink drawing basically on paper. I usually concept a piece digitally and then trace the basic composition on a piece of paper. And I do that with the very light pencil first, and then work my way into the darker values over time. So first I would use softer pencils to outline the basic lines that are important to me. I think I use two different types of pencils in the beginning that have two different softnesses, so are different light or not light basically. And I just mark the lines that I think are important to the piece before I go in with an ink pencil and continue making lines with that. As you can see, I later on pick a thicker ink pencil to block in shapes like the leaves or her head or sweater, which I try to keep very loose, so you would always see like a texture from the ink pen. Sometimes even white parts will still show through in the end. I really like that. I don't like it when it's perfect. If I would want to have a perfect surface in the end, I would just do everything digitally. So I really welcome all of the imperfections in this step because I think this gives the piece quite a lot of character in the end. I scanned the piece in and I opened it in Photoshop, where I first free the pencil drawing from its background. There's a short sequence of commands that I do to get that, so I don't have to just put multiply layers on top basically, but I can paint underneath the drawing and I can color the drawing in, which you have seen previously. I can just pick basically the drawing and make it red or even yellow, whatever I want, and then paint underneath, so it gives a very interesting color variations that shine through that. And that's something that I really like to do. I will write this sequence of commands that I do to get that in the post of this time-lapse video, so you can check it out there and try it yourself. Yeah, so there are a few elements in this piece that I tried to keep until the end because I knew I wanted to animate them, which is first of all the hair strains in her face, as well as these little plants that I paint right now. You will see that I will delete those specifically that I just did quite soon again, but I will do similar elements. I will add similar elements later again. I just didn't like those specific ones, but usually I would try to add all elements that I want in a piece quite early, so I don't have to add anything later, because that's, for me at least, never worked out so well. I did several tries of establishing a lighting situation, as you can see right now. This is not the final one. The final one is much simpler. Although I don't quite know why I didn't go with this one. I think at the time this wasn't something I had in mind. But as I was editing this video, I had a few stages where I was like, why didn't I went with that? Why wasn't it the right thing at the time for me? I really like it now, but well, I threw that away. So, but you can still see all the tries that I did with different colors and different lighting situations. I usually take a lot of time to get the overall color established in a piece. I use tons of gradient map layers or color lookup layers, which are kind of like filters. I don't know. That sounds a bit cheap, but I usually start out just picking colors that I feel like could be the right ones, but they are usually very desaturated and don't really look very good at all. So I build up from that by putting adjustment layers over adjustment layers, and then I put one on top of it and mask out only specific elements that should have these overlays. And by that, I think this is how these color schemes happen in my paintings. It's a lot of experimenting and knowing what kind of mood you want and let that inform one step after the other until I feel like this is what I wanted from it. Here you see that I put an adjustment layer on top of it and just mask out her hair and her face and her head, I don't know. But it's still not something I'm going to go with until the end. But that's what I mean, like you have these adjustment layers and they are only part of the painting and add something there. And then you put another one on top, especially with the light that works very well. I usually use either, I think, screen color dodge overlay or soft light for, depending on how strong I want the lighting to be, to establish the lighting. So I would add this layer, mask everything out so it's not there, but then paint on the mask to free the reflections, basically, if you know what I mean. By the way, if you have any questions on this process, because I'm trying to talk about it while I'm watching it myself, and I am sure I might miss something that could leave you with some questions, just leave them in the comments and I will get to that. Sometimes I even, if the image is already quite light and I want the color that is already established to be the in light value, I would put an adjustment layer on top that would make everything else darker, and then I erase it out, the reflections basically. And I always try to make the shapes that are created with the light and the shadow serve the overall composition as well. I think it's very important that you think about that when you add color and shadows, especially if they are hard shadows, which I often use. I use them quite a lot. I don't want them to disturb the overall understanding of the piece. So sometimes I did not use a specific lighting situation that you see me block out there because maybe I thought it makes the understanding of the piece a bit more difficult, or maybe the shapes aren't as flowy and matching to the rest as I would like them to. So this is always something that I keep in mind. what I did now is I added a black and white adjustment layer on top of everything. This is super helpful if you want to keep track of your overall values in the piece. So you can always turn on the black and white layer to see if the contrast between different elements in the piece is still there in the values. You can, of course, consciously decide to put the contrast in only with color hues, but that usually isn't as salient as having the contrast also in the black and white version. If you have a composition and it works in black and white, meaning you have a clear separation between important elements and you have less contrast where you think is less interest needed, less focus in the piece, then it usually works in color as well. So this is always a very, very nice and easy trick to check your piece. I know that some people even work in black and white first and then put color in, but I don't like that very much. For me, the color finding process is so integrated in everything that I do there. It's just not for me. Right now, I am adding more texture to the piece because, yay, you all know I love a lot of details and textures. These are just little lines that I do in the background because I had the feeling that the background and everything was still looked a bit too digital, meaning too clean to me. So I added this little noise back there, and it's always something where I zone out and basically have a little break. I can just doodle these little lines in the background and have fun with that. And by now you can see which is the final reflection pattern on her face, which is much smaller and much more subtle than a few of the ones that I had before. But I really like that because I thought it did not destroy the overall shape of her face that I established during the drawing phase. With the other ones, I wasn't sure what the shapes would do to how the face was perceived overall, and just having these light spots on her nose and over her lips and her chin made this area pop the most, which I really, really liked. And it also kind of comes from the right as well, where the window is, but of course, having this reflection, you would assume that there is another window more up front, otherwise that wouldn't work, or the window you see is very long. But I'm not about super correct lighting situation, I just want them to convey a mood, so I'm not like ray tracing all the all the light rays back to where they come from and then decide whether it makes sense or not. If you're into that, that's awesome, but for me it's not important. It shouldn't disturb you and make it harder to understand, but as long as it does not do that, I don't think it has to be 100% perfect to make a piece that works for the viewer. Yes, I already told you I had these hair strains and other plant elements before. I deleted those and now I just added them back in. Make sure if you want to animate your piece later on to have parts that you know already will be animated. Keep them on separate layers as much as you can, as long as you can, preferably until you animate. I'm usually really bad at that. With this piece, I managed to keep these hair strains that I just added, as well as another plant that's not there yet, but coming soon, on separate layers, which helps me a lot when I'm animating, because I don't have to, because usually you're going to select what you're animating, and then you're animating it, and if it's on a separate layer, you don't have to worry about the background that's revealed when you move whatever was painted there before to the side, you know what I mean? So that's much easier, but you can still animate parts that are completely integrated into your animation. That's not a problem, it's just a bit more difficult. Oh, and I already added some sparkles with the color dodge layer. I like these little, it's like when you see dust particles in sun rays that come in through the window. That's always what I'm thinking of. So I have these little dots and particles that flow through my piece. They are also a very neat element to animate when you do an animation later. And they already, just by animating these little particles, you already have like, it feels a bit more alive already. And what I just did was overlaid the entire piece with two of my textures that I use a lot. They are basically paper textures that have little stars on them. Those of you who already have my resource packages should have them already. Everyone else will find them in the texture and brush post that I'm going to make. But yeah, they basically give the entire piece more texture and grain. And this is basically something that I always do, and I really like to have this more textured feeling everywhere, basically. And this is the plan that I added later on as well, and which I will keep on a separate layer because I already know that I want it to move a little bit and some sort of wind that comes in probably through the window. And I already know that this part will be very easy to animate, which is awesome. Yes, I outline the main element, which is her, with a little bit of a thicker line. In this stage, I'm almost done with the piece, but I want to make sure that the background and the person get the right contrast between each other. I don't want her to disappear in the background, but I want her to pop out kind of from the background, which is why she is much darker than the background, and also the contrast inside of her shape is much higher than the contrast in the background, which is also, yeah, as I already said, lighter overall. And right there, I was trying to also establish a color difference a little bit. So the background is a bit more yellow and she's a bit more red. A little bit more of those hair strains that I'm going to animate later. I thought it looked kind of too simple and too clean overall, and it would add to her silhouette if I would add more hair to the sides that kind of break this clean silhouette. So that's something I also keep in mind. It's like if I blind out everything that is inside of her shape and just see her shape, is it an interesting shape? Because that's something that's hard to see sometimes when you are drawing and you have all these details, her face and her hair that you can concentrate on, but also see what is the shape and does it make sense for the composition? Is it interesting to look at all by itself? Or is there something that I can improve, even with a little detail maybe? I think I'm adding a few more hair strains right now, which I'm not going to keep. At least the upper ones, I think, are not in the final part, if I correctly remember. Oh, and the pattern on her shirt, of course, I added digitally. I do make corrections to the drawing before I even free it from the background in Photoshop. Just basic symmetry things, or where the scanning didn't work well, or if I wanted to have specific elements that I already planned before, I sometimes add them even before I do all the digital painting thing in the beginning. But we are at the animating part already. I think at some point I should do a whole video just on the animating part, because you're only getting the speed up version of it in this one, because this video is already so long. But if you're interested, let me know in this post if you would rather have only the animated part next time, or if you would like the animated part to be a bit more present. I work with the timeline window in Photoshop. If you open that, you get this window below your working space, and there you can have different frames which you can see there. And frame by frame, I either turn layers on or off. And if I have a specific element, let's say a leaf, for example, from the plants, I would have like 3 or 4 different layers with this leaf on it by copying and selecting and copying it. And every time I would change the shape of the leaf a little bit using the Puppet Warp tool, which is under Edit. So I select the leaf, I go to Edit, Puppet Warp tool, and then I can deform the leaf. So I have 4 or 5 layers of this leaf, and frame by frame I can turn one on after the other. So you have little variations in the shape of this leaf, which leads to this animation in the end. The easiest thing to do for me in the beginning is to animate the little particles in the drawing that I overlaid. I make several layers with these particles on. I can either draw a new layer, make new particles, or I use the one that I already drew and then transform them, like rotate them or mirror them so they are always in a different position. And when I then let the animation go through every frame, you see this movement of these dust particles in the air. This is easy to do in the beginning. It's the fastest way to bring some form of movement into your image. After that, you just saw me animate the plant on the bottom right. For that, I use the Puppet Warp tool. When you made a selection in Photoshop on a specific layer, you can go to Edit and then Puppet Warp. And what it does, it basically lays a wireframe on top of the selection that you made. And by clicking onto the wireframe, you fixate points by making pins on that wireframe. And when you then take one of the pins by drop and drag, you will see that you can deform this morph or deform the shape. So what I do is I have something like a plant on a separate layer, and I will duplicate the layer. If I only have this one specific element on the layer, I don't have to select it additionally. Sometimes I have one layer where I have several elements on that layer, and then I will select the one that I'm currently want to puppet warp. But if it's only one item on there, you don't have to do that. You can put the wireframe on top and then slightly move the leaf or whatever you are animating in the direction you want it to move. Be careful when you're doing that to not overdo it. In that case, where I only want a very slow and small movement, because I overall still want it to be the same image with the same basic composition, and the movement is supposed to be very, very subtle, I make sure that the difference, the changes that I make with every frame, with every layer, are very small. After I did it once, I can duplicate it again, depending on how many frames I have. I'm just seeing 6 frames here. I think it could be that I went with 6 or 8 frames, but it's not always the same number of frames that I use when I animate. It usually depends on exactly the type of animation that I want to do. I think there is a bit of experience necessary to know what kind of things you want to move. Usually it's you can do a straightforward animation, like for example, if you want the leaf to tilt to tilt left, you can just do so by just putting the top of the leaf more and more to the left. But maybe sometimes it makes it look more vivid and alive when you maybe change the thick or thinness of the leaf in between, because it maybe suggests a little bit of a 3-dimensional rotation or something. But that comes with experience, and you have to try out what kind of movements you want. Another tip that I would recommend is when you animate several elements in a picture like this, make sure to make a shift between the different beginnings of the animation. If every one of your animations is 6 frames long and starts at the same exact moment, it looks very, I don't want to say stiff because it's already animated, but it looks a bit, you can definitely, it all has the same period, you know, it looks a bit boring and you can tell when it starts from the beginning. So what I would do is some of my elements, sometimes if I have 6 frames, there will be elements that only have like a 2-frame period. So I only have 2 different layers that I switch on and off, whereas some take the full length of the 6 frames. And then also I will make sure to change on which frame a specific animation will start. So for example, there is one plant where the animation starts on frame 1, and there will be another plant where the animation starts on frame 3. So just to shift everything against each other to make the result doesn't look too, I don't know the word. You don't want the period of your animation to be so obvious, and you don't want everything to cycle in the same frequency, because that doesn't look super convincing, you know? Please leave comments below if something that I said wasn't very clear, and I will make sure that next time when I show a time lapse with an animation, I will explain it, because I'm sure for the first time hearing it, it might be a bit confusing, and I don't know if I have made sense. I haven't explained it to anybody yet, so that would be a big help for me too, if you would just let me know where things are confusing here. If you want to export your animation when it's done, you can go to File, Export, and then Save for Web and or Legacy. It is called, and there on the top right you can choose what kind of file you want to export as, and you go for GIF 128. And then you will have some options beneath them, and if you want to push your GIF to the maximum quality, I would suggest to go from 128 different colors to 256, as well as I think the other one is actually the quality that you the dither. You want it dithered, and you want to bring the dither up to 100% as well. And then you can click export. You can also say how big you want the GIF to be, and then you can click export and it will export a GIF for you. For now, if you want to animate, just play around with this timeline window and the different frames and turning on and off layers and see what you can do with that. I hope this is something useful for you. Let me know what I could improve. Let me know what you would like to have more focus on, what kind of questions you have. So next time, next month, I can do a voiceover addressing these specific things. Thank you so much for being here on Patreon and supporting my work. Have a wonderful week and a wonderful next month. We probably write on Patreon a little bit. You hear from me. And yeah, until the next voiceover. Bye bye!